Third phase of moon.
We have an unidentified flying object.
So that would be one definition. And there's a second definition that I like to work on, and it's a little bit more subtle, and it goes like this. From the 1950s on, at least into the mid-80s, and it hasn't exactly stopped, when a contactee claims that he or she is in conversation with an extraterrestrial civilization, what is it that they say? Well, they say that we on Earth need to stop the testing of nuclear weapons. We need to disarm. We need to take the kind of political action necessary to defuse the bombs that threaten us with world war, especially nuclear war. And more recently, extraterrestrials are said to be telling our Earthlings that they're very concerned about the ecological health of our planet and that we need to take some responsibility for taking care of the life that is here on our planet. And these messages, to me, look a lot like the kinds of messages that the prophets of ancient Israel would have delivered. It's just that now they come from the mouths of aliens who are visiting us. And I want to say that's a good message. And I want to say that the quality of that message, namely that we should for world peace and for ecological health, that's a good message. So if I'm going to talk about UFOs being God's chariots, I think that's that second sense in which I would like to say, yeah, I think UFOs could be God's chariots. And to me, that's a little bit more important than perhaps the ancient astronaut theory.
You know, one thing I take from the famous movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Okay, Earth, we have a 4.5 billion year history. The dinosaurs had their reigns for millions of years, and in that 4.5 billion year range, you know, Homo sapien is just such a tiny snippet of the time. And when ETs are coming here and telling us what we need to do to preserve the planet, to stop this nuclear testing and blowing up, not because I think the nuclear weapons don't just affect the planet. I think they affect the entire universe and possibly other dimensions, which is why I think they started showing up more en masse, but also to protect the other species. And one of the things in that movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, is that the ET is specifically in this newer one with the Keanu Reeves, I don't remember his name, Klaatu or something. He said that, you know, this is not your planet. And that's a very good statement. That's right. We are just, yes, we live here, but we are just visitors. You know, we're the caretakers, the current caretakers, because before us there was, you know, other living organisms. There was the dinosaurs. Before that, for millions of years, there were the trilobites. Now it's the humans' time. So I think we're replaceable in that sense. If we screw this up, I think they are having a contingency of possibly repopulating it with these hybrids. And speaking of hybrids, what do you think about that? Do you think the reason they're making these hybrids is to upgrade our DNA, or do you think it's to help them, or do you think it's to repopulate Earth after we destroy ourselves?
Well, that's a good question. But Dr. J, I'd like to go back to The Day the Earth Stood Still. I'm glad you brought up that movie, because I think in all of these years there have been only 2 movies that are authentic UFO movies. And the first one is The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951. Not the remake that you mentioned. I think the remake simply lost the sense of what is authentically a UFO phenomenon. And the second one is 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, with Spielberg as the director, and Spielberg said that when he began planning that particular movie, that he thought he was going to produce a sci-fi thriller. But when he investigated the UFO phenomenon, he said, oh, this is religion. Now, I trust Spielberg. He's got that sort of artistic sense. He gets an insight into culture. And most movies dealing with aliens tend to have the theme of a war between Earth and these other planets, and it looks like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union just exported to space. But these two movies, Close Encounters and The Day the Earth Stood Still, the first one, fits the psyche of people involved in the UFO movement. And it's so important to see how in the first movie, which is a little bit more clear than the 1977 movie, the first movie, notice that Klaatu, who visits us from outer space, tries to get world peace on the part, and he tries to do it through bringing together the leaders of the various nations, the presidents and the kings and things like that. And that utterly fails, because the politicians cannot get their act together in behalf of world peace. So what does he do? Well, he goes to a second group, and these are the scientists. Note where he doesn't go. He doesn't go to the university. He doesn't go to the church. He goes to the scientists. Why? Well, the scientists are international. And if you may remember that great final scene on the mall in Washington where Klaatu is giving a speech and the scientists are sitting there in their chairs. They're of different races. They're men and women. We have Sikhs in their turbans. And what one of the messages is that science can bring the whole human race together in a way that politics cannot. Well, I see this as a reflection of what happened just 4 years prior, if you may remember. Not that you were there, but you may have read about it. Namely, that after the United States dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II, that there was a big controversy about what should happen with nuclear knowledge, the knowledge of nuclear fission. And one proposal was that it would become internationalized, because there was a fear that if it wouldn't become internationalized, then we'd have a competition in an arms race. And Harry Truman said, no, we won't do that. And so this was an enormous failure on the part of our political leadership. And even though the scientists gave us the bomb, gave us the potential for self-destruction, they also are pictured in that movie as the potential saviors of the planet. And I think what's so important is that as the UFO phenomenon then winds its way over the next 6 decades, that one of the chief images that we get of the UFOnauts who visit us is that they look kind of like scientists. They're gray, and they don't have much emotion, and they go about their work as if they were doing research. In fact, how many abduction cases do we have, which includes the ones that you had just mentioned, the hybridization cases? But even before that, before the hybridization cases started in the late 80s, but prior to that, you had a number of abduction cases where Betty Hill or Sandy Larson, or these cases where the abductee would be laid out on a bench, and then these science-looking guys, aliens, would come and examine their bodies. Well, what are they doing? Well, it's some kind of research. And so this image has been built into the phenomenon all along, that in outer space, there's a more advanced civilization made up of scientists and technologists who are coming here, and you know what? maybe they can prevent us from destroying ourselves, and they're going to do it with their more advanced science and technology. Well, in the book, UFOs and God's Chariots, I try to develop this, and I try to describe it as a myth. It's not a myth in the sense that it's false. It's a myth in the sense that it embodies human hopes and dreams that go way beyond what politics can deliver, or in some ways even beyond what science can deliver. And in a secular society where we cannot believe in angels anymore, we think, oh, maybe advanced science and technology can replace the angels of old. But what's really going on, I think, is this frustration we have. We can't get world peace. We're constantly on the brink of self-destruction. Wouldn't it be great if the same science and technology that gave us the bomb could also defuse that bomb? And so that's the kind of God's Chariots theme that I sort of work through the phenomenon, not just, abductions, but also what's going on with the lights in the sky and the radar trackings and the UFO religious groups and all of that kind of thing. I'm just trying to kind of put all that stuff together. And this little battle we have about who is the true scientist, those NASA and SETI people, are they the true scientists? Or are the UFO nuts and bolts researchers the true scientists because they're more open-minded? And I think all of that is part of this grand phenomenon I call the UFO phenomenon. I think I talked too long there, didn't I?
No, not at all. This is exactly what we want to get. This is the kind of information that we have you on for. And, you actually brought up a good point, and this leads to the next question. Well, it's actually two. I want to go back to the ETI myth soon, but will these visitors from an advanced civilization in outer space bring salvation to Earth in the form of more advanced science, technology, medicine, and ethics?
Yes, that is what some people hope. And what I find fascinating is that you can find exactly this same hope amongst SETI scientists and amongst UFO believers and the UFO communities, because what they share in common is, I call it the ETI myth, that these spacelings are more advanced in science and technology, that somehow or other they got through the period of developing nuclear weapons and found a way to maintain peace. Therefore, they've got something in the way of morality to teach us. They're going to teach us morally how to prevent ourselves from self-destructing, and that is the equivalent of salvation. Well, then if you add on top of it, and you'll see in so many UFO abduction cases where the earthling will say, well, they're hundreds of years old. In fact, I don't know how old they are. It's almost like eternity, that through medical science, the spacelings have found a way to beat, if not death, certainly dying early. And so they're going to bring us, with science and technology, they're going to bring us things that previously were religious hopes. But now they're going to be scientific and technological hopes. And I just want to say you'll find the same structure of what I call this myth. It's not that it's false, it's just that it's not scientific in character. UFO people will report basically the same hopes that you're going to get from the SETI people.
And this goes actually back to something that I was about to say before we came into break last hour. I think one problem that science has now is they try to keep science just by itself. And in order to have, I think, a deep understanding with UFOs and everything else, you can't just, look at science. I think consciousness and your your religious beliefs and your spirituality all come into play. And when they try to separate the two, I think that's where the problem is. That's probably why they're not getting the answers they want, is because they're trying to separate something that's inseparable. And what's your take on that?
Well, I would like to just elaborate on this fine point that you've just made and make two sub-points. One is it has to do with the scientific method. How is it that you go about doing research? And you have a limited number of questions. You only ask for natural explanations for natural phenomena. And so there's all kinds of other meaningful things in life, but the scientific method deals with this narrow range of knowing. And so, one scientist can be a nerd, and the next one could be a windsurfer, and that's got nothing to do with their science. They still have this very narrow method, and the method does not allow them to study history or study UFOs. But then, and here's my second point that I want to build on your point, Dr. J, and that is that frequently when scientists try to draw a picture of reality, they smuggle discarded religious beliefs back into their science. They just kind of dress them up so that they look natural, but they are religious beliefs smuggled into their science, and then their science begins to take on grandiose visions and claims about our expectations for these very highly intelligent extraterrestrials who can do things with science that we would call miracles and all of that kind of thing, for which there is zero empirical evidence. And there's not even a good theory, let alone empirical evidence to support such extravagant beliefs. But because they sound like they're good scientists with regard to where they can genuinely claim accomplishments, when they smuggle these religious beliefs in, you get the feeling like, whoa, they're pretty smart scientists, therefore we got to believe them. And they're just peddling the same kind of myths and fantasies that you're going to find everywhere in the culture, and we're supposed to believe it because they're scientists?
I know. That's exactly one of the biggest problems is because they have that title, that right, that's what gives them the final authority. Are we supposed to? And that's sad, that the way we've caused will come. And another thing too is speaking of, just because they're scientists, do we have to believe them? I think sadly the way our society, now this is taking a little turn, but sadly the way our society has become, in order for somebody to believe something, it has to appear on the mainstream news and usually said by a politician, or if it's a science fact, it has to be said by a scientist from a notable university, usually backed by politicians. So, for instance, I think for UFOs, the only way people are going to believe is if the President of the United States says it. But if he doesn't say it, you could provide all the evidence in the world, but people won't. And that brings us to our final break. Everybody stay tuned. Third Phase of Moon Radio will be right back with Ted Peters. Welcome back to the final leg of Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, and we have been speaking to Professor Ted Peters, author of UFOs, God's Chariot. I'm going to let him do his plugins real quick, but let me give everybody some announcements. First, do not forget the contest, exclusive Revolution Radio Third Phase of Moon contest. You will be earning up to $4,000 in prizes in forms of tickets. One ticket per week for 8 weeks starting next week. All you have to do is go to contactinthedesert.com/third phase of moon and put your name, email address, and your name. If you're a winner, your name will be announced right here live on our show. Also, if you've captured anything amazing, please send it to us via Skype or Facebook at Third Phase of the Moon. And do check out the YouTube channel. There are over 1,000 UFO videos, plus several of our old radio shows from this with lots of great footage. And also do follow us at Facebook, at Twitter at Third Phase of the Moon, and you could also follow yours truly at Dr. J. Andy Elias with an I. Now, Mr. Peters, I want to give you a chance to tell people about your book, where to find it, and about your site before we get cut off from the show. Go ahead, Mr. Peters.
Well, thank you, Dr. J. The book is called UFOs, God's Chariots, as you've mentioned, and New Page is the publisher, and yes, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and the other suspects, of course, all have it available. My website is called tedstimelytake.com, but it doesn't deal strictly with UFOs. My larger field is the relationship between religion and science. And that's mostly the kind of material you'll find there. I have a number of theological briefs, on various topics. And an item that I don't think we've mentioned but could be of interest to some of your listeners is the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey. It raises this question that what would happen. And actually, Dr. J, you raised this earlier with reference to President Eisenhower. What would happen if we had confirmation or gained confirmation that there is an extraterrestrial intelligent civilization? What would happen to our culture, our social structures, etc.? And specifically, what would happen to religious belief? And in this study, and I summarize it briefly in the book, but it's online, the entire study with all of the data, I asked people in a survey if we could confirm the existence of extraterrestrial intelligent creatures, how would this affect your own religious beliefs? Would you face a crisis? Would your religious beliefs collapse? And actually it wasn't to my surprise, but I think it'll be to the surprise of many. Overwhelmingly, we're talking about 90% plus of the respondents said, no, my faith, my religious beliefs would not suffer a crisis. Either they were neutral or they were quite affirmative of the possibility. Had one Protestant say, I'd share a pew with an alien any day. I love that one. When it comes to Roman Catholics, mainline Protestants, and evangelical Protestants, which in this case includes fundamentalists, all of them were just about the same, 92%. Are saying, no, I'm not going to have a problem. When it comes to the Buddhists and the Mormons, it's like 100%. I mean, there wasn't a single Buddhist or a single Mormon who said that they would have some trouble with this item. We didn't have enough Muslims and Hindus to be statistically significant. Nevertheless, we got comments from those who responded to the survey, and we got the standard comment, this universe is really big, there's no reason for us to think that our little planet is all alone, and a couple Muslims said, I'm sure that Allah wants more than just us earthlings to glorify God. So let me just say that this was so overwhelming, and the data is there for anyone to look at. Now, let me just add an interesting caveat. We did ask a number of other questions, one of which was, even if your own religious belief system would remain intact or unaffected, what do you think about other people's beliefs? Well, there was a little bit more anxiety registered on that question than on the first question, maybe about 10% change in those who responded to that. That is to say, another 10% a little bit worried about somebody else's belief system, not their own. But what was dramatic was how people who declared themselves non-religious responded. Now, the non-religious group includes both atheists as well as people who are spiritual but not religious. And I think if I were to do the survey again, I would probably cut that group in half and distinguish them. But these are self-selected non-religious people. And on the question, what do you think would happen to other people's religious beliefs? The majority said, I think those religious people would face a crisis and, in fact, their religious belief system might collapse. So it became quite clear that those who are worried that there might be a collapse of religious beliefs are the non-religious. The religious people don't think that about themselves, but the non-religious people think that about those other religious people. Well, at any rate, that's the study. Again, I summarize it just a little bit in this book, but you can find it on my website, tedstimetoTake.com. But it's actually hosted by a friend of mine on another website called counterbalance.com, which is dedicated to the dialogue between religion and science. So, at any rate, for those who are interested, find your way.
You actually answered the question I was going to ask you, which was about your ETI Religious Crisis Survey, and I think it's so ironic and true of what you said, that the non-religious, the atheists, are more worried about what they think the religious, the people who have a religion are going to have their religion collapse when it's actually, as your data showed, that's not the case. And one thing I thought that was really interesting is when you mentioned that there was no problem whatsoever with 100% of the Mormons. I think that fits in line perfectly because in their religion, the angel Moroni, could, if you go back a few hundred years, the term angel was being used. Now we're using the term grays or extraterrestrials or extra-dimensional. Maybe Moroni was an ET, and maybe that's why they are so open to it. And, of course, I figured the same thing with the Buddhists and the Muslims, too. For thousands of years, they've been talking about jinns and other things. So I pretty much think that they've already been exposed to that. And for thousands of years, they've already had the open-mindedness. It's just some of the last people that are holding back, but it's just a matter of time, like you said. Anyway, I knew this would happen. We are down to the last 13 minutes of the show, and I still have tons of questions to ask you, but let me get to a couple, and then maybe you can, speak of what you think are the most important topics that during this last end of the show. For that matter, should Christians believe that God has become incarnate many times, once for each intelligent species on each planet in space?
That is a very important theological question. Yes, it's speculative, but it's okay for theologians to speculate, I think. And the issue is not a new one. We get it already in the 16th century. The issue was raised, actually all through the Middle Ages. The question of intelligent life on other worlds was debated amongst theologians. And Philip Melanchthon, one of my ecclesial ancestors, a reformer in Germany, said, no, there are no extraterrestrial lives because we cannot imagine Christ going to other planets. So it's important to note that it's not a new question, and I mentioned Vatican Observatory, Jesuits a little while ago. Once in a while they get talking about this one as well. So this past spring, I guess we're still in spring, aren't we? In Berkeley, we had a seminar, and within this seminar we actually debated the issue, and we created two sides. One side would be saying that God would provide an incarnation for each and every intelligent species on different planets. There'd be the multiple incarnation theory. Then the other side said no, that God's incarnate work in Jesus Christ here in the history of Earth suffices for the whole cosmos. And then we tried to muster theological arguments that would support each of the two positions and went back and forth. And one of the things that we teased out of it is this, that your answer has to do a little bit with what you think the purpose of God's incarnation is. If you think the purpose is basically revelation, that is to say that in the incarnation in Jesus Christ, we learn something that has always been true about God, namely that God is gracious. God creates the universe out of love. God has promised a redemption of all that is in creation, and in this case it would be universe-wide creation. If the purpose of the incarnation is to reveal that truth, then that would support the idea of multiple incarnations, that God would want to engage in that sort of revelatory work wherever there would be intelligent beings who receive it and appreciate it. The other position, the one that says, oh no, one Jesus Christ is enough for the whole cosmos, seems to imply that what is important there is the work of Christ, what Christians frequently call the atonement, the achievement of salvation, that somehow or other God's work in Jesus Christ changed the nature of reality, an ontological change, to use a philosophical word, and that now because of this act, that the whole of the physical world is open for renewal, open for the new creation, open for the kingdom of God in a way that it wouldn't have been without. So if that is the reason for the incarnation, then it wouldn't matter which planet it occurred on, just so it occurred somewhere. Anyway, I just want to report that we went back and forth and debated on this. We had our students take positions and write papers, and that's about as far as we've got. I can't tell you which position is better than the other. I can report, however, that there are critics of Christianity, and I'm thinking here of Paul Davies, a colleague and a friend at Arizona State University, who's a physicist and an astrobiologist and highly respected in the field of science and religion. And Paul insists that the idea of multiple incarnations is absurd, that we'd have to have a planet-hopping Christ that races around the universe. I don't find it absurd, but Paul does. And when I tell him that I've run this survey, actually he's looked at my survey materials, and we find that Christians, just right along with other religious people, seem to have little or no, relatively little problem with the prospect of extraterrestrials. Paul insists, well, they might have answered the survey that way, but when push comes to shove, we'll see that their faith is not strong enough to tolerate it. And the reason is that they can't answer this question that you just asked about one incarnation versus multiple. And I'm just reporting here that's where the conversation is going, and we keep dancing to this music. And I think one of the tasks of astrotheology is to explore this. I don't know exactly what the right answer ought to be, but it's a good time for us to be asking questions like this.
Agreed. And, you know, with your colleague, Paul, I think that's the issue is it's divided. You know, some people, like you said, you know, believe that what is a Christ-like figure going to hop from Earth to Earth-like planet to another one. Well, what's to say that there isn't, you know, God being on every planet and a Christ figure being on every planet at all times? I think that's that is not too far-fetched at all, and I tend to fall on your side, and so do many other people. And now I want to go back to something that was mentioned earlier, because this was something that came up in one of our roundtables and also in one of the shows. Some people believe that the belief in UFOs itself is a form of secularized religion. And I wanted to ask you that because obviously there was that cult in 97 that killed themselves for following that comet. I forget the name of it. If you remember, it wasn't Halley's Comet.
Hale-Bopp.
That's right. That's right. The ironic part is, though, they said that there was a UFO in its tail, right? Well, guess what?
Yes.
Within days of that happening, what occurred? The Phoenix Lights. What if really they were onto something? Now, I don't agree that they, had to commit suicide, wear Nike shoes, and carry pocket change for a toll. But what if they were onto something in the sense that there was a craft in the tail? Because sure enough, days later, there appeared this mile-wide craft that crossed over the Phoenix, for that matter. So anyway, I just want to go back to this. What do you think of people grouping the belief in UFOs as a religion?
Thank you for that question, Dr. J. It's a good one. I'd like to describe three aspects of the UFO phenomenon. The minimalist would be if you see an unidentified light at night or a flying saucer following your car as you're driving down the highway. I don't see anything religious about that. It may be strange, it may be exciting, etc., but it's just a strange or an anomalous experience. It's hard to explain. So there's no religion involved there. But secondly, with regard to this larger culture, a sort of mental set, what I call the ETI myth, that you see in the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. You see it in the contactees of the 1950s. You see it in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. These are the places where it comes to articulation, but in general, it's a secular form of religion. As I said earlier, it looks kind of scientific, but built within it are all these hopes and expectations that science and technology will save us, and if earthly science and technology can't do the job, then a heavenly one that drops down out of heaven is going to do it. So at that particular point, it is looking like a religious phenomenon. Spielberg saw that when he made his movie, and I've never met him, but if I did, I'd pat him on the back because he had that insight. Well, then the third group that you mentioned, the two, Bo and Peep, actually, they called themselves Heaven's Gate when they committed suicide. I actually communicated with them when they began in the early 1970s when I wrote the first edition of UFOs, God's Chariots. I even quoted my personal correspondence with them. I had no idea when I wrote the first edition that this was going to end up as a suicide cult. But in this case, you really do have a religion that turned idolatrous. Bo and Peep originally thought of themselves in biblical terms. In terms of the book of Revelation, they called themselves the Two. They got that from chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. It was sort of a quasi-Christian cult, but it morphed into a suicide cult, and one of the reasons for the transition in their doctrine was they had a low opinion of the body and a high opinion of the disembodied soul. And when Hale-Bopp came, they thought at that time Applewhite the man was still alive. Nettles, the wife, had died. Applewhite said that there's the UFO. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of our bodies and our souls will travel up and get into that UFO, and that will take us to paradise which exists on another planet elsewhere in space, and so that's the reason for the suicide. I want to say that's a bad thing. I think it's idolatry in the sense that they invested their ultimate concern in the finite delusions of this man named Applewhite, who had put together this kind of concocted worldview. So I want to say that relatively few of us are that extreme, but in terms of the larger culture, and this is one of the points I want to make in my book, those religious elements are present in the UFO phenomenon in a disguised way, and they become visible in an extreme case such as the Heaven's Gate suicide. But they're there in a more latent form, somewhat disguised form all the time, and that in itself is not necessarily unhealthy. It's just that I think from time to time we need to pick through and just see what might be going on.
Mr. Peters, we are out of time. Any last words before we go off? We got about 10 seconds.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Dr. J, for pressing forward on this important subject matter, and
We have an unidentified flying object.
Third phase of room.
take some responsibility for taking care of the life that is here on our planet. And these messages, to me, look a lot like the kinds of messages that the prophets of ancient Israel would have delivered. It's just that now they come from the mouths of aliens who are visiting us. And I want to say that's a good message. And I want to say that the quality of that message, namely that we should strive for world peace and for ecological health, that's a good message. So if I'm going to talk about UFOs being God's chariots, I think that's that second sense in which I would like to say, yeah, I think UFOs could be God's chariots. And to me, that's a little bit more important than perhaps the ancient astronaut theory.
You know, one thing I take from the famous movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Okay, Earth, we have a 4.5 billion year history. The dinosaurs had their reigns for millions of years, and in that 4.5 billion year range, you know, Homo sapien is just such a tiny snippet of the time. And when ETs are coming here and telling us what we need to do
in the UFO movement, and it's so important to see how in the first movie, which is a little bit more clear than the 1977 movie, the first movie, notice that Klaatu, who visits us from outer space, tries to get world peace on the part, and he tries to do it through bringing together the leaders of the various nations, the presidents and the kings and things like that. And that utterly fails, because the politicians cannot get their act together in behalf of world peace. So what does he do? Well, he goes to a second group, and these are the scientists. Note where he doesn't go. He doesn't go to the university. He doesn't go to the church. He goes to the scientists. Why? Well, the scientists are international. And if you may remember that great final scene on the mall in Washington where Klaatu is giving a speech and the scientists are sitting there in their chairs. They're of different races. They're men and women. We have Sikhs in their turbans. And what one of the messages is that science can bring the whole human race together in a way that politics cannot. Well, I see this as a reflection of what happened.
Third phase of moon.
We have an unidentified flying object.
So that would be one definition. There's a second definition that I like to work on, and it's a little bit more subtle, and it goes like this. From the 1950s on, at least into the mid-80s, and it hasn't exactly stopped, when a contactee claims that he or she is in conversation with an extraterrestrial civilization, what is it that they say? Well, they say that we on Earth need to stop the testing of nuclear weapons. We need to disarm. We need to take the kind of political action necessary to defuse the bombs that threaten us with world war, especially nuclear war. And more recently, extraterrestrials are said to be telling our Earthlings that they're very concerned about the ecological health of our planet and that we need to
do to preserve the planet, to stop this nuclear testing and blowing up, not because I think the nuclear weapons don't just affect the planet. I think they affect the entire universe and possibly other dimensions, which is why I think they started showing up more en masse, but also to protect the other species. And one of the things in that movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, is that the E.T. is specifically in this newer one with the Keanu Reeves, I don't remember his name, Klaatu or something. He said that, this is not your planet. And that's a very good statement. That's right. We are just, yes, we live here, but we are just visitors. We're the caretakers, the current caretakers, because before us there was other living organisms. There was the dinosaurs. Before that, for millions of years, there were the trilobites. Now it's the humans' time. So I think we're replaceable in that sense. If we screw this up, I think they are having a contingency of possibly repopulating it with these hybrids. And speaking of hybrids, what do you think about that? Do you think the reason they're making these hybrids is to upgrade our DNA, or do you think it's to help them, or do you think it's to repopulate Earth after we destroy ourselves?
Well, that's a good question. But Dr. J, I'd like to go back to The Day the Earth Stood Still. I'm glad you brought up that movie, because I think in all of these years there have been only two movies that are authentic UFO movies. And the first one is The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951. Not the remake that you mentioned. I think the remake simply lost the sense of what is authentically a UFO phenomenon. And the second one is 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, with Spielberg as the director. And Spielberg said that when he began planning that particular movie, that he thought he was going to produce a sci-fi thriller. But when he investigated the UFO phenomenon, he said, oh, this is religion. Now, I trust Spielberg. He's got that sort of artistic sense. He gets an insight into culture. And most movies dealing with aliens tend to have the theme of a war between Earth and these other planets, and it looks like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union just exported to space. But these two movies, Close Encounters and The Day the Earth Stood Still, the first one, fits the psyche of people involved